The blockbuster documentary series Breaking Through on China Media Group's military channel continues to air, with the latest episode featuring the silhouette of China's naval flagship, the Type 09 IV ballistic missile nuclear submarine. As China's second-generation and latest-generation ballistic missile nuclear submarine, the Type 09 IV builds upon the Type 09 II, which addressed the fundamental issue of existence or absence, and has begun to establish China's sea-based strategic nuclear strike capability. It holds significant historical importance in the development of China's sea-based strategic nuclear forces. When it comes to ballistic missile nuclear submarines, many military enthusiasts have something to say. For example, the most typical example is that the Chinese Navy, or the Soviet Red Navy, deploys its ballistic missile nuclear submarines in fortress seas. The concept of fortress seas has evolved over time, with numerous such fortress seas being identified from north to south. So, what exactly is a fortress sea area, and what are the deployment and operational patterns of ballistic missile nuclear submarines? In fact, based on the information currently available, the so-called fortress sea area is largely a summary by NATO countries of the deployment positions and patterns of Soviet ballistic missile nuclear submarines after the end of the Cold War, rather than an official term used by the Soviet Navy. NATO countries observed that Soviet ballistic missile nuclear submarines were primarily deployed in Soviet coastal waters, particularly in the White Sea and Barents Sea regions beyond the Murmansk and Arkhangelsk bases of the Northern Fleet, as well as in the Okhotsk Sea region of the Pacific Fleet, which is shielded by the Kuril Islands chain. Soviet ballistic missile nuclear submarines rarely ventured beyond these waters. Additionally, when ballistic missile submarines operated in these waters, the Soviet Navy often deployed forces to provide cover. For example, on the surface, the Navy would deploy large anti-submarine ships to sweep the waters where ballistic missile submarines were present for any NATO attack submarines, and would also deploy aerial anti-submarine forces to conduct large-scale submarine searches in the area. Additionally, when ballistic missile nuclear submarines were deployed, attack nuclear submarines would accompany them. These surface and air anti-submarine forces, combined with the submarines operating underwater, formed an integrated system with main attack forces, auxiliary forces, and protective forces. The waters in question are precisely those where the Soviet Union can effectively control and ensure local naval superiority. Deploying ballistic missile nuclear submarines in these waters is akin to deploying them within a fortress where they hold an absolute advantage, theoretically ensuring absolute safety. Therefore, NATO referred to the Soviet Navy's deployment strategy for ballistic missile submarines as the fortress strategy, and the waters where these submarines were deployed were naturally called fortress waters. In essence, this term was first used by the Soviets, then summarized by NATO, and later adopted by China as a guiding principle. So, what kind of tactic is the fortress sea area, and is it the optimal deployment model for ballistic missile submarines? It can only be said that the fortress tactic was the least bad option for the Soviet Navy after a comprehensive evaluation of various tactics, but it was not necessarily the most efficient deployment tactic for ballistic missile submarines. The fortress sea area tactic of the Red Navy is described as the least bad tactic. For the Soviet Red Navy, there was already a significant gap in underwater warfare capabilities compared to the US Navy, let alone the Soviet Union's equally prominent disadvantages in terms of geopolitical factors. In terms of the performance of the Red Navy's submarine warfare equipment, the ballistic missile submarines of the Red Navy lag far behind the attack submarines of the US Navy in the performance of some key subsystems. For example, in terms of sonar system performance, while US attack submarines had already achieved digital beamforming and multi-beam capabilities as early as the 1970s, the Soviet Red Navy was still relying on outdated single-beam sonars, or spotlight sonars at the same time, resulting in a generational gap with the US Navy. In terms of stealth performance, the Soviet Navy had long adopted a strategy of sacrificing speed for stealth, so stealth performance was not a top priority for the Soviet Navy. Compared to US attack submarines with superior stealth capabilities, the Soviet submarines' inferior stealth performance made them easier to detect. For example, in terms of fire control command system performance and submarine-launched missile system performance, the Soviet Navy lagged behind the US Navy for a long time. It was not until the mass production of the 971 class submarines before the dissolution of the Soviet Union that their overall performance roughly matched that of the US Navy's 688 class submarines from the late 1970s, with an even greater gap in missile-equipped nuclear submarines. The inferior performance of Soviet equipment compared to the US Navy meant that Soviet ballistic missile nuclear submarines had little chance of success when operating outside their own systems and engaging the US Navy in open ocean conditions. Additionally, the Soviet Union faced greater geographical disadvantages compared to the United States, with its major ports either semi-enclosed or surrounded by island chains. The U.S. Navy could fully exploit this advantage to launch offensive anti-submarine warfare against the Soviet Navy, such as deploying attack submarines at the exits of island chains to await Soviet ballistic missile submarines venturing out. Combined with the previous factor, this made it extremely dangerous for Soviet nuclear submarines to break through the island chain and the U.S. offensive anti-submarine warfare blockade. Instead, deploying them in waters closer to home, where they could be protected by other friendly forces, was considered safer, hence the origin of the term fortress seas. It was not that the Soviet Navy did not want to venture into the open ocean, but rather that it lacked the capability to do so, both geographically and tactically. So, how effective is the fortress sea area in practice? It can only be said that its effectiveness has deteriorated over time. On one hand, since the fortress sea area is quite narrow, the US-led NATO can easily use oceanographic survey ships to conduct hydrographic surveys and data collection in the waters where the Red Navy's ballistic missile submarines operate during peacetime. After all, the Red Navy's operational range is highly predictable, so focusing hydrographic data collection on this specific area is sufficient. On the other hand, the U.S. Navy can routinely use stealth-type attack nuclear submarines to infiltrate the Red Navy's fortress sea area and hunt down Soviet nuclear submarines operating in this area. If one attempt fails, they can try again. Over time and with accumulated experience, the success rate increases, and their understanding of the operational patterns of Soviet nuclear submarines becomes increasingly comprehensive. Ultimately, the deployment model of the fortress sea area is similar to the sprint-style launch of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. The locations of several mountain-based silos are relatively fixed. By continuously monitoring these silos and accumulating intelligence, it is possible to effectively track the movements of launch vehicles. The Soviet Navy was no exception. In fact, since the 1970s, the Soviet Navy's ballistic missile submarines had become increasingly vulnerable, even when operating within the fortress seas, frequently encountering tracking by U.S. Navy attack submarines. This marked the U.S. Navy's offensive anti-submarine warfare extending into Soviet territory, completely disregarding the existence of surface and air-based anti-submarine forces within the fortress seas. By this point, the Red Navy's continued reliance on the fortress seas strategy had become somewhat outdated. Of course, since the Red Navy never resolved the issue of submarine stealth, coupled with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it remains unclear whether the Russian Navy has abandoned the fortress strategy. Compared to the Russian Navy, China's conditions for developing fortress seas are even more challenging. When the concept of the fortress sea area first gained traction domestically, numerous fortress sea areas were identified from south to north, with regions from the Bohai Sea to the South China Sea all being labeled as such. In reality, a significant portion of these areas do not meet the criteria for a fortress sea area. The Bohai Sea, Yellow Sea, and East China Sea are not deep enough, and for ballistic missile submarines, this depth is insufficient for effective concealment. The South China Sea is deep enough, but it hardly qualifies as a fortress sea. Naval vessels from various countries, civilian ships, and ocean survey ships come and go, making it almost like a free market at sea. The conditions for a fortress sea are still insufficient. Therefore, ultimately, the greatest advantage of ballistic missile nuclear submarines is stealth, and the most advantageous stealth battlefield is the open ocean. This determines that ballistic missile nuclear submarines must operate in the open ocean. For example, the U.S. Navy's Ohio-class submarines deployed from the Kitsap Bangor base have nearly the entire North Pacific as their operational range. The Ohio deployed from Kings Bay base covers the entire Central Pacific as its operational range. The French Navy operates along the West African coast and in the Caribbean Sea, and the British Royal Navy deploys its Vanguard-class submarines near the Falkland Islands. They don't bother with talk of fortresses or non-fortresses, and this should be the standard deployment pattern for ballistic missile nuclear submarines. For China, ballistic missile nuclear submarines will eventually need to venture into the open seas. The question is simply when China will gain control of the seas. Ultimately, only with control of the seas can ballistic missile nuclear submarines operate freely.